This week's reading involves the book of Job from the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. Because this is our first overtly religious text that people still hold sacred, I'd like to begin this lecture by talking about reading sacred texts as literature, instead of reading them theologically or for life application. First off, sacred texts are the very first texts to which scholars applied close reading methods, as it was very important for these scholars to first understand what the text was telling them. To that end, let me provide some guidance for how to read Job that you can also employ later this semester when we read selections from the New Testament, the Quran, and other sacred texts. The first consideration when approaching a literary text is form. In other words, broadly speaking, what kind of literature are you looking at? Is it a poem? Is it a novel? Is it an allegory? A work of history? In literature, quote, meaning is communicated through form, starting with the words of a text, but reaching beyond to considerations of literary genre and style, close quote. Riken, 2569. Taking Job for an example, since we're reading it this week, you will see immediately that there are two forms competing in this book, a prose section at the beginning and end that reads like a story, and a long poetic section in the middle. By noticing that there are two forms of literature, or genre, in this book, I know two things. One, I cannot categorize this book neatly as just one genre of writing, and two, I should expect different things from the prose portions than from the poetic. When I'm reading a story, whether it be a fable or a biblical narrative or an epic, I am looking out for characters, setting, and plot. When I read poetry, I am looking for figurative language, imagery, and formal elements like rhyme or meter to communicate the deeper meaning. As in the book of Job, the main literary genres found in the Bible include narratives and poetry. Within these big categories are smaller subgenres like travel stories, hero stories, history, and parables for narratives, or lyric poetry, laments, hymns, or epithalamions, to name a few, for poetry. It's important to consider the genre and subgenre when analyzing sacred texts because, quote, genres have their own methods of procedure and rules of interpretation, close quote. Riken, 2569. Most of Job is written in the poetic form, but what can we find if we look closer? More on this in a little bit. There is no specific author given by the book of Job itself, but that hasn't stopped people from speculating on Job's authorship over the years. Jewish tradition holds Moses to be its author based on the fact that Moses spent time in Midian after killing the Egyptian and before returning to Pharaoh's court to enact the plagues. The land of Midian is close to a possible site of the land of Uz, mentioned as being Job's place of residence. Other author possibilities offered up by scholars throughout the centuries include a patriarch like Abraham or a returned Babylonian captive. The bottom line is that we can't say for sure who wrote Job, but we can extrapolate something about him. Kenneth Lang Harris and August Konkel have made a list of the anonymous author's attributes as follows. The author is fond of Proverbs. See Job 4:8, 5:7, and 11:12. The author is a Hebrew and knows Hebrew scriptures well, quoting or paraphrasing the Psalms and Isaiah in places. The author is knowledgeable about a range of topics, including nature and animal life from various regions, constellations of the night sky, meteorology, and travel. The setting of the book of Job is a land of Uz. In your Norton anthology, the translator, Robert Alter, argues that, quote, Utz or Uz means counsel or advice, so the story takes place in an unreal, fabulous landscape, the land of counsel, close quote. See the note 1 on page 94. However, many scholars contend that an actual physical location is indicated instead. Harris and Konkel locate the land of Uz, southeast of Israel, maybe in Edom, which lies in modern-day Jordan. Others propose that the land of Uz might be in modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia, triangulating the location from the location of the attackers that killed Job's children, Chaldea and Saba, and the nationalities of Job's quote-unquote comforters. Settling the date for Job is as tricky as determining its author, and the question of when Job was written has been under discussion since ancient times. Of course, when dating Job, we are looking at two separate moments, that of the action of the book and that of its writing. In terms of the book's action, it may be very, very old indeed. The events discussed in Job may date from the patriarchal period of Jewish history, circa 2200 to 1990 BCE, making it a near contemporary of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Job could have been Abraham's contemporary. The writer uses the names for the Hebrew god Eloah and Shaddai, most commonly employed before the burning bush incident in Exodus, where God tells Moses to call him I am, or Yahweh. Another dating for Job's life is the Mosaic period, around 1400 through 1200 BCE. Dating the writing of the book is even trickier. The character Job was certainly known in the 6th century BCE when Ezekiel, writing around 600 BCE, mentions him by name, along with Moses and Daniel. This does not mean that the book of Job in its present format was written down at Ezekiel's time, but that the story was well known. Job could have been written in its present form, either during the exile of the Israelites to Babylon, 587 to 538 BCE, or it could be post-exilic. Whether Job was written before, during, or after the Babylonian captivity, most scholars date the writing of the book, but not necessarily the action, to the 6th century BCE. Who is Job the character? We know several things about him. Job is a wealthy man, as wealth was counted in how many animals you had back in the 2nd millennium BCE. Job has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yokes of cattle, 500 female donkeys, and numerous slaves. He also has 10 children, 7 boys and 3 girls. So not only does he have great wealth, but he will presumably be able to pass down his wealth to his children when he dies. We can see that Job is most likely not a direct descendant of Abraham, but some of his associates might be. Bildad is a descendant of Abraham through Keturah, and Elihu is a descendant of Abraham's nephew. Job serves as his own priest, and we see him offering his own sacrifices to God, as Abraham does in the book of Genesis. Finally, Job is recognized as a holy man in Islamic tradition as well as Judaism and Christianity. He is mentioned in the Quran in a list of 25 prophets, and both Lebanon and Oman claim to host the site of Job's tomb. The Book of Job is certainly a product of its time and place of production, as it was influenced in themes and language by Israel's Near Eastern neighbors. George Brooke argues that the core of Job is a very old song, and that the book was continuously added onto throughout several centuries. The German biblical scholar Hartmut Gese puts forth that the original folk book of Job survives only in the prose sections, and that it was, quote, patterned after 3 Mesopotamian texts, in which an answer of God came to the sufferer, close quote. See Parsons, page 214. Regardless, Job is taking common tropes and plots from the ancient Near East and combining Jewish theology in an act of syncretism, a combination of different beliefs and cross-cultural influences. Parsons notes that in terms of genre, which we'll get into in a moment, Job also has much in common with the Near Eastern disputation or controversy literature. In its poetry, ancient Israel was definitely participating in its larger Near Eastern culture, something we must keep in mind when we read the Bible as literature. The Israelites were not cut off from their neighbors, and cultural ideas would have flowed through Israel for geographic reasons alone. Israel's proximity to Egypt and to various Mesopotamian empires that came and went in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, its location on the Mediterranean, and its status as a land bridge between Asia and Africa meant that the cultures of the major civilizations at the ancient world blended in the land of Israel. Turnage, paragraph 2. Other ancient cultures, like Egypt, also wrote wisdom literature, and ancient Mesopotamian manuscripts dating from the 3rd millennium BCE also wrestle with the idea of the righteous sufferer, like that found in Job. We should not be surprised to find these influences in the Hebrew Bible. The language of Job has some distinguishing features that make it stand out from other books of the Hebrew and Christian Bible. First of all, the book contains a disproportionately large number of words, 20 total, that appear only once in the entire Bible. These are also known as hapax legomena, Greek for once spoken. There are also Ugaritic influences in Job. Ugarit was an ancient port city in northern Syria near the modern-day town of Latakia, which had its own alphabet. Scholars identify some common phrases from Ugaritic in Job. As discussed before, in order to properly analyze any work of literature, we must first look at its genre and generic, which means related to genre in this sense, features. However, looking at genre is difficult with the Book of Job, since the book combines several different genres and subgenres. The reader can determine right away the major division between prose and poetry, just by a quick glance. But Gregory Parsons goes farther into analyzing the genres of Job by identifying three main subgenres at work here: the lawsuit, the lament, and the controversy dialogue, also known as a dispute. The text itself prompts us to look at Job in terms of a lawsuit from the first prose section, where Satan, which is the title of a job in Job instead of a proper name for a fallen angel, acts as an accuser or prosecutor, asking God to find fault with Job. We can also, according to Parsons, see Job bringing a countersuit of sorts against God. The friends act as his witnesses, with chapters 4 through 14 serving as an attempt to reconcile the lawsuit out of court. The main court proceedings would then, according to Parsons, run from chapter 15 to chapter 31. When God gives us a response to the suit in chapter 38, Job withdraws his suit. We also see much in common in Job with other lament poetry in the Old Testament. The lament in Job runs for quite a long time, according to Klaus Westermann, which is summarized in Parsons, from chapter 3 through chapter 29. The third subgenre is the controversy dialogue, a genre in which two or more characters engage in a conversation about an issue. There is an Akkadian work called Dialogue of Pessimism from the 12th century BCE, where a master and slave discuss the value of revolution in bringing what today we would call social justice. See Doak, page 10. The literary forms in Job give us a window into ancient Near Eastern cultures. In terms of other literary features, the Book of Job makes heavy use of dramatic irony, which is where the audience knows something that the characters do not. In this case, we the reader know that God is allowing the Satan to test Job's righteousness by inflicting terrible suffering on him, but neither Job nor his helpful friends know this. Other forms of irony which we may encounter this semester include verbal irony, where the speaker says the opposite of what she means, and situational irony, when characters' intentions are foiled, or they work to bring about one outcome only to have the opposite outcome ensue. When discussing irony in literature, please note that, in the immortal words of Weird Al Yankovic's parody Word Crimes, quote, "Irony is not coincidence," close quote. The writer of Job engages in paronomasia, or wordplay, or punning. But due to the fact that we are reading this work in translation and not in ancient Hebrew, we miss this. For example, in Job 3:25 through 26, there is a play on words that we miss. The word translated as fear means both dread and something you stirred up. This double meaning adds a different interpretation to Job's lament. We can also see examples of parallelism, a common feature in Hebrew poetry. For example, consider Job 5:11 through 12. For crime does not spring from the dust, nor from the soil does wretchedness sprout. See how the idea of sin and soil is repeated? This particular parallelism is also called a chiasmus, a sentence structure named for the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X, where you put in AB, crime and dust, and get out BA, soil and wretchedness. The original audience for Job would have appreciated the many instances of alliteration, assonance, and even the occasional rhyme. In addition, the speakers in the poetic sections often give soliloquies, which we'll see again in other works like Hamlet. A soliloquy is the act of a speaker speaking his or her thoughts aloud when alone or regardless of any other hearers. A main theme running through Job and common to other works from around the ancient Mediterranean is theodicy, or a vindication of divine goodness. In fact, you'll find a theodicy of sorts at the end of the Iliad, which we'll read next week, when Priam and Achilles are talking, so be sure to look for it. Although theodicy isn't a concept unique to ancient Israel, their interpretation of the theme most certainly is. Often you'll find a theodicy boiled down to this question: how can a just God or gods allow evil and human suffering, especially the suffering of the innocent? Ancient and modern humankind wrestled with this issue, and we see Job and his associates struggling to make sense of Job's afflictions. His friends, assuming that God is just and almighty and knowing nothing about the trial that's taking place in heaven, decide that Job must have failed in some way. But the book of Job shows us that in the real world, innocents do sometimes suffer. In this case, God becomes an enigma that he does not choose to explain to his creation. The wisdom literature subgenre in the Bible, of which Job, along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, traditionally is classified, continually wrestles with the question, why do bad things happen to good people? I'll ask you to wrestle with the same question as you read Job. And, just so you know, it's okay not to come to a complete answer. After all, if this were an easy question, writers from the ancient world through today would not have continued to pose it to themselves and their readers. For a listing of the references given in this presentation and those I used to prepare my own notes, along with a word-for-word transcript, please consult the lecture notes for Job linked on the Week 3 instruction page on Canvas. Thank you, and goodbye for now.